Well, thank you for coming this morning. We're going to talk about the budget for next year. At least we have a budget, unlike the state of Illinois. When I was the county auditor, I used to have a crystal ball on my desk for forecasting. It was actually a joke. But this year is sort of more uncertain than most because of the lack of a state budget and because we have a lawsuit that's before the Illinois Supreme Court, which is going to determine whether hospitals pay their fair share of taxes. So the overview, I'll give the overview, and Elizabeth Hannan will give you some more of the details. But basically, because we're so uncertain and we're in kind of a tight financial situation once again, this budget is based on holding the line on recurring expenditures as much as possible. We do have labor contracts, so we have to build that in. Salary increases, but we're not hiring new people basically, and we're not starting new programs, but we are dipping into our fund balance to do certain capital improvements, which if we didn't do would cost us more later. So that's the basic theme of it, and we basically are appropriating, not necessarily spending, but appropriating $49.5 million, and the revenue we think is going to be $45.4 million. So that really represents some dipping into the fund balances to pay for capital improvements. So I'll go on. We're also holding the line on property taxes. City property taxes have fallen as a share of the total property tax because when the hospitals stopped paying their taxes, the city realized that was going to be really hard because we're right next to the city of Champaign. So we actually lowered our levy to keep our tax rate from going up. We used to be about 15% of the bill, now we're down to about 13%. But I think I've said it many times, and I'll just say it one more time for you, that when Carl stopped paying their taxes, the total levies didn't change, and so the share of people who were paying it changed, and their share got shifted on to everyone else. So we're going to try to hold the line on health insurance. In this county, we were told that we pay 35% more than the same health insurance in Chicago, and that's because there's no competition here. There was just a study that was done by some researchers at Johns Hopkins University, and they said when there's a big insurance company to counteract a big hospital, then that tends to keep the prices down. But in our case, the big insurance company is owned by the big hospital, so we get the worst of both worlds. We don't get the competition. So I think that's something that we're going to be looking at not only in this state but nationally. And recently there was a lawsuit filed by a big property owner in Chicago questioning whether hospitals should be getting this tax break after the appellate court ruled it was unconstitutional. So that's interesting. But this is going on in other states as well, this whole issue of what is not for profit. And when you have the 10 most profitable hospitals in the United States out of 3,000 that they looked at, 7 of the top 10 are quote-unquote not for profit. So that tells you they're making huge profits, but they're just not paying taxes. So we've got some major capital investments. Windsor Road, people ask a lot about. That we're going to have to find out exactly what the problem is, and there are experts on concrete. They don't agree on what the problem is, so it's kind of hard to solve it if you don't know what the problem is. So we have to wait until we have a really good agreement on how to solve it, and then we will try to finish that route as quickly as possible. We've completed Olympian Drive, but we're not going to open it because the township supervisor of Summer Township said that the old Lincoln Avenue, it can't take the heavy truck traffic. Our plans for the new Lincoln Avenue have been held up by one last property owner, so we have to get that finished. So the Summer Township road commissioner asked us to hold off on opening up Olympian Drive because he was afraid his road was just going to get destroyed by the heavy truck traffic. So we are honoring his request. So some of the things are beyond our control, but I certainly made a lot of requests to MetCAD to spread out their increases over a longer period of time, and so they've agreed to do that, because we were facing, I think at one point we had a 27% annual increase, so we had huge increases, and now they've lowered it to 6%, and they're stretching it out over more years. And we continue to work on the whole idea of allowing this county and all counties that had a voter referendum to charge what their voters agreed to. So we have to work on that, and I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards, but I will now turn it over to our Finance Director, Elizabeth Hannan, who has done a fine job.
So I think the mayor made a good point, which is this is really, I would describe it as a kind of boring budget. On most things, we're holding the line. There are a few what I would describe as course corrections here. So, good, Jason got that up over there. So in terms of course corrections, the city's vehicle and equipment replacement fund was in a situation where it would not have been sustainable. So we would not have been able to provide the equipment that city employees need to perform their jobs. Within a couple of years, that fund would have been in a deficit. And so the budget includes additional expenditures to make that sustainable, adjustments to the annual transfers, shifting some operating expenses that were in the vehicle and equipment replacement fund back to the general fund, and additional one-time transfers of $2.7 million over 3 years. Also, another course correction is the supplemental capital improvement fund. In the past, funds were transferred from the capital improvement fund to a fund called the Supplemental Capital Improvement Fund, which was mostly paying for operating expenditures. And we didn't think that was consistent with council's intent when they decided how to fund capital improvements. So we are shifting operating expenses of more than $150,000 into the general fund, which now ensures that all the transfers made to the capital improvement fund are in fact used to pay for capital improvements. In addition, our Economic Development Fund had no ongoing source of revenue other than revenues from Market at the Square, which are used to fund the market. And so we've shifted about $38,000 in economic development expenses into the general fund. And there's a little change also in how we're accounting for revenues and expenditures as of FY15, and you'll see this in the charts later, but basically we're moving closer to cash basis accounting, and you will see that this affects some of the revenue numbers on the charts that are coming up. Some of the new expenditures that the mayor talked about include significant transfers for capital improvements. So we have a base level of $690,000, but we've made additional one-time allocations of nearly $1 million in next year's budget to pay for facility improvements. That's about $223,000. And those are pretty basic needs like roof repairs. Also an additional $250,000 to supplement our budget for asphalt overlay to help maintain the condition of the city streets, and another $500,000 for funding for the MCOR project. In addition, we're including some support for the library on a one-time basis, about $125,000 to help pay for improvements to their HVAC system, and $30,000 to offset the first-year cost of hiring a fundraiser for the foundation, which we think in the long run will help to cover some of those costs of facility improvements that they're going to have down the road. There's a few changes in the budget document format, which you'll see when you look at the document, which is now posted on the web. Basically, there's some additional information summarizing debt and property taxes, and we've shifted some information, the ordinances, into the back of the document. So looking at the numbers, in revenues for all funds, as the mayor said, we'll be at $45.4 million next year. You can see that that's a decrease from our estimate for the current year. And the reason for the decrease isn't is that in the current fiscal year, we had some fairly large one-time revenues. That includes $1.5 million that we received from distribution of Provena property tax for TIF 3. So at the end of last fiscal year, we paid that to the county, and then they distributed it back to all the taxing districts, including the city, at the very beginning of this fiscal year. About $3.8 million in revenues in capital improvements fund from reimbursements and state and federal grants. And the end of TIF 1 on December 31st, 2016 also affects our total revenues. In terms of expenditures, you can also see there's some significant fluctuation here, and most of that relates to capital improvements. Capital expenditures in this chart have been as low as $9.4 million in the FY17 budget and as high as $18.5 million in the FY16 estimate. So that doesn't really reflect any change in our commitment. It's more just timing of projects. Also, there's a large blip in expenditures for services in FY15, and that is the $11.6 million distribution of Provena property taxes, which I just discussed. It was an expense for us in FY15, but a revenue in FY16. And just to note, personnel costs in FY17 are more than half of expenditures for all city funds. Looking a little more closely at the general fund, revenues in the general fund are $33.1 million. Sales tax continues to be our largest source of revenue in the general fund. It makes up nearly a third of the total. This is a concern for us just because sales tax growth has not been keeping up with cost increases. So we really hope in the future to see some significant retail development, because without that, it probably won't grow faster than the rate of inflation. Income tax is about 13% of general fund revenue. However, that's a state shared revenue, and as the mayor mentioned, the state does not have a budget, and that has been on the table in the past as a budget balancing measure from the state. In terms of general fund expenditures, this graph shows over time our expenditures by classification. As you can see in the general fund, 70% of our expenditures are for personnel costs. So that's a huge cost, and that has been increasing faster than our revenues are growing. There are no capital expenditures in the general fund itself, since those are generally in the VERF or in capital improvement funds. Interfund transfers is the second largest category of expenditures in the general fund, and that's 16% of the total. Those are for things like supporting the vehicle and equipment replacement fund and capital improvements. In terms of expenditure increases in the general fund, the largest increase is in interfund transfers. That category is increasing by 31% or $1.3 million. That is largely transfers to the vehicle and equipment replacement fund and capital improvement funds. The next largest increase is a 25% increase in services. $400,000 of that is a one-time cost in next year's budget related to financial software and to work order software in the Public Works Department. That's an important investment to ensure that we're functioning efficiently. Also, we have an increase in our costs for the METCAD dispatch agreement of $129,000. So now our budget for next year includes both the deferred payments, both of the deferred payments that Council and the METCAD board approved over the last couple of years, as well as the full amount required according to METCAD's budget. In terms of fund balance in the general fund, which is something that we watch very closely, you can see that it has increased over the past couple of years from $3.1 million at the end of FY14 to $6.1, and then $8.7 million projected for the end of the current fiscal year. And then you can also see next year that we would spend down some of that to pay for funding equipment replacement and capital improvements. The green line on this chart shows 15% of recurring expenditures, which is our proposed policy limit for a minimum amount of fund balance. And then in terms of comparing recurring revenue and expense, which is really how we determine whether we have a balanced budget, you can see those figures here over 3 years. Squiggly line at the bottom is supposed to tell you that the axis isn't at 0, just so I don't confuse anybody. But you can see that last year we were able to maintain a balanced budget with both expenditure reductions and revenue increases. This year, that's a little bit closer, but we still clearly have a balanced budget. Looking ahead, the mayor mentioned we're expecting continuing uncertainty with the state budget and the hospital properties and their taxability. We plan to continue to maintain our recurring expenditures below recurring revenues to give ourselves some flexibility, and we continue to maintain reserves to deal with that uncertainty. In terms of budget review, tonight, after we do this overview for the City Council, we will talk about the Executive Department, Finance, and Community Development budgets. On May 23rd, we will talk about Public Works, the Library, Fire, and Police. And also that evening, we'll discuss the financial policies. On June 4th, we'll hold our public hearing, and then we plan to adopt the budget in a special meeting on June 13th. So that's basically the financial rundown. I think we're happy to take questions.
I'm just wondering, the whole with the hospital situation, not getting that, the hold in place by the Supreme Court, how much is that trickling down or hurting everything else?
Well, it really affects the total tax rate in Urbana, which is mostly the schools and the park district. The city, we have an interest in that because we want the city to be competitive and we want to have a future rather than being, always behind. So it would be good if we get it settled, and I think we're going to probably get it settled sometime this year. But it doesn't affect our budget directly so much as it does the overall picture for the taxpayers in this city.
So you said this year, do you have a specific time of when the Supreme Court might take that up? Or
No, we don't know. We think it's going to be sometime this calendar year, but that's not in my crystal ball.
Sure. The capital improvements that are listed here, was that a concerted effort in this budget to devote money for that, or was it just timing that in this particular budget year there was a need to fund a lot of capital improvements?
Well, it's both. Some street things, that there's a specific calendar for getting the MCOR project, all these kinds of things. But we also have a specific goal that we want to deal with problems before they get to be more expensive. So we're paying the money up front to avoid having worse problems further on. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we had a number of requests from departments, and in reviewing the requests and making decisions about what to fund, we definitely made a conscious effort to put additional funding towards capital improvements as opposed to other things like, additional staffing or increasing other recurring expenses in department budgets.
And you mentioned Windsor Road earlier. I know this is another crystal ball question, but do we know when we're going to see clarity on that, and whatever the disagreement is about what's going on, when it's going to get sorted out?
We don't know when we're going to get clarity, but we do know that we have to do it right, and we can't do it right until we know exactly what the problem is and how to fix it. And so we are working with the contractor, and both the contractor and the city have hired consultants. So we are committed to getting it done as quickly as we possibly can. Ideally, we'd like to get it done this construction season, but I've been gone. I left on Thursday to go to a college reunion, so I haven't heard recently if the consultants have come to some kind of a consensus on it yet. But we want to get it done, but there's no point in pouring money into something unless you're really solving the problem.
So is it known right now what's causing the problem?
There seems to be some disagreement, the last I heard. Have you heard anything new since then?
No.
Okay. So people say, well, why aren't they out there working? Well, they can't work until we know exactly how to solve it, because we can't keep redoing this road. We have to fix it and have it be lasting for a while, because this is very expensive to have to redo things.
But is it safe to say that the city and the contractor are cooperating in this? There's
Yes,
no
yes. We don't want to get into a big battle. We want to work it out and get it done as quickly as possible.
I guess, going back to what you said in the beginning, that some of the uncertainty with the state and with the hospital situation has kind of made this a hold the line budget. And if I recall correctly, that was kind of the theme last year as well. Do you foresee having to continue to do those type of budgets in perpetuity, or do you ever foresee a time where you kind of are able to open things back up a little bit?
We're getting really good at hold the line budgets. We've been doing them since like 2008. Every year it's the same thing. So there are a lot of unmet needs. I mean, people complain about potholes, and so we got a local motor fuel tax to do that. The alternative was named potholes. This pothole fixed by the Foster family with a little plaque. Didn't think that was going to work too well. So we're fortunate to be able to have some flexibility because we have home rule. So we can't do everything at the same time, and we try to hit the highest priorities. And we are short of money, but I think we're, trying to do the best we can. And certainly if we can expand the tax base, that's going to help us. And what we're doing is we established an enterprise zone. We want to encourage commercial development and residential development. We are creating a tax increment finance district, which is also going to be geared toward that same thing. So we are doing everything we can to try to build the underlying base and to encourage retail, because we're so dependent on the sales tax, but we do everything we can to try to stimulate economic growth.
Any possibilities on retail things that you mentioned, you need some development or?
Well, we have this project that's going to take place north of the building here, and that's going to have retail on the ground floor and underground parking. So that seems to be the theme. The new buildings that are going up generally like to have retail on the first floor and then commercial or residential above that.
Any updates on the hotel, Landmark Hotel? I know you were working with get a new owner on that.
Well, it's the News Gazette had an editorial on that, but they didn't realize that we got our money back. So it wasn't a bad investment. And I would point out when people say let the market do the job, we exist to try to help the market. We don't just say, oh, let the market do the job, let everything deteriorate. That's why we have TIF districts. And I would point out that the city of Champaign, which now has a thriving downtown, went through decades of struggle trying to affect the market. So they had a TIF district there, and they had consultants that told them, close the street, make it into a pedestrian mall. That didn't work. So 10 years later, they had another consultant that said, take out the mall, let cars go through. So they've worked for a really long time, and it's a success. And Urbana is working too. You cannot get these things done overnight. They are very long-term projects, and I think everybody that we've talked to said a well-run hotel can thrive there. And we've talked to hotel consultants. So we don't just do these things blindly.
So when the new owner is in place, would the city be open to doing an agreement with that person similar to what you did with XJ?
Well, it won't be similar, but we want to work with whoever. That's why we want the TIF there, because we want to be able to use that to help new development. And we would like to have a very good hotel there. It's a beautiful building. It's on the National Register. And we don't want to just tear down every historic building in Urbana. We want to preserve the best, and that's one of the best.
Can I ask you something about tonight's
Sure.
Did your proposal to lower the fine associated with drug paraphernalia, is that just seen as a natural thing since you lower the fine for?
Well, for some people, I would rather not, would they vote for $25? I'd rather see, I wanted the original one to be 100, and you just have to have the votes to do it, so it was 50. I think this one should be 50, but we'll see. I think, there's some discussion about lowering all the fees and all the fines, and I think you have to be careful about that because you don't want to trivialize things, and people are talking about victimless crimes, and maybe we shouldn't have a fine for loud music in cars. Well, you have to look and see, and I want to talk to neighborhood organizations about that. And so we're willing to look at things, but we can't just say whoever complains about it is going to be able to get the fine lowered. We want to, have something that's reasonable. Perfection is beyond our grasp, but we strive for reasonableness. Anything else? Thank you very much.